A little time, which we good, so we can open up to some healthy discourse. But seeing as though we have this gift of time and these gifted speakers up here, I kind of want to open it up at first before we jump to the audience. If we could have a conversation about, I think consent was really at the core of all of this. And so I would like for a moment to expand on that. Of course, all the way to the audience is right. You know, we have the idea that there is no way of consent. And then on the left, we have, we don't know how to gauge consent. And I think we have a quite appropriate moderate in the middle. How do you think? How does everyone, how would you see consent ever being given? Or I mean, you said that it's possible for people who can't communicate on a code. And then, are you in any way, what are your thoughts? Let's open up a conversation.
All right, I'll speak first. That's all right. So the problem with consent when we consider non-human animals in particular is that we are already, right at the outset, mapping a particular human, we'll call it an entity. So this human entity, this human idea called consent, we're already, right off the bat, mapping that onto non-human animals the minute that we say that they can even think about granting consent. So that's an inherent problem. And then on top of that, we have difficulty communicating between two people with the same language from the same place at the same time. We have difficulty getting ideas across. We require multiple words for individual concepts in order to attack it from various angles. Conversations have to be had. Total communication is necessary in a lot of senses, so just a verbal communication isn't going to be sufficient. Sometimes it requires those facial expressions, those body movements, that kind of language. So all of these things are required, but when two people are very alike. So to try to assume that we can use those same kinds of techniques on something that is very, very different, structurally, mentally, dispositionally, is pretty presumptive, especially when we have no means of working that out, trying to figure out what it is that they mean by certain things. So, and this is true. We do this to ourselves. We do this to our own children. We say, when you're older, you will understand. You'll have enough rationality, enough knowledge, enough wisdom to be able to consent to certain things. Destroying your body on your own, choosing certain kinds of emotional connections, driving a damn car, whatever. There's all these things that we won't even allow our own children, who sometimes are very are directly genetically similar to us. So again, how can we imply this equal level of rationality, this equal level of understanding of the consequences of particular emotional action to something that we can't get to explain to us what they mean.
Okay, so what you're saying, just to sum it up before we jump to you, is that consent can only come from equal intelligence, from equal life forms.
Really. To communicate.
To communicate. Okay.
Well, and so obviously non-humans cannot be verbally communicative to humans. And because I am studying bestiality, we are introducing a non-human into the human realm. Therefore, I do think that we do have to apply this human entity onto the non-human, although it is problematic. I agree with that. There's no other way to study bestiality. And I think that if you just say, okay, no, non-humans cannot consent, you just go down the line saying, okay, well then all bestiality is abusive. But I'm interested in the bestiality that might be consensual, the people out there, the zoophiles, who are being trapped by this system of taboo and who don't feel comfortable, and that's why I study this. So yeah, I do agree with your points, but I have a mini situation I just want to think about. So say you have someone who just got out of, a human who just got out of the shower, is lying on their bed naked, and their dog comes up to them and starts licking their genital areas. If the human is fine with it, not backing away, how is that not consensual? How is that abusive if the dog is the initiator in this sense, and there was no, there was no, I'm trying to think of a word.
Violence?
There was no violence, but there was also no coercion by the human for the dog to do this. I think it's an interesting event, and it is problematic to push this human notion of consent onto the non-human, but because we are introducing non-humans into our relationality, I think it's important to talk about consent. Otherwise, we just go down and say it's abuse.
Yeah, we can take it right.
Well, there's a question. So, but then what happens if we really want to clear the consent abuse framework and we want to think that, and I don't have an answer to this, but maybe there's a way to make sex okay that we don't base on whether it was consensual or not, right? Because consent is so problematic. If you're talking about people with cognitive disabilities, how does that person consent? And even with children, I mean, at what age does someone go from being a child to an adult? It can't be the legal one. It can't be the day you turn 17. You can now consent to these things, and if you have shared different languages, but like you said, even if we're both speaking the same language at the same time, and I say the word yes, I might be saying yes to something totally different than what you think that you're asking me for. So maybe if consent doesn't give us an answer to whether this is ethically okay, is there another thing besides consent that can make sex relations or any relations morally okay? What can replace consent? I think just doesn't work. I don't know.
Well, if I could just quickly give maybe a little spin on perspective on consent. I mean, we have people fighting for their own right to end their life, and consent has been given explicitly for people at end of life who want to end it. And so, this issue of consent is quite contentious, I think, all through society. But even when consent is explicitly given, with people who are dying, it's still denied. So I think maybe consent's not really getting us anywhere because it has to be communally agreed upon consents almost. It's well, it doesn't matter if they were okay with it. If we were okay with it, then it was okay. Almost.
With horizontal incest too, with a brother and sister want to have sex with each other and they're both adults and we don't say that they have any other mental health problems and they're consenting, but we still say that that's not we, but some people still say that that's
truth by consensus, like Wikipedia. Almost.
Mm-hmm. For me, consent is the wrong place to start the discourse. I just think it's not the right point. You said there's no other way to study or what I refer to as zoosexuality, bestiality, except via consent. And I just think that's the wrong place to start. That's jumping far into the argument, if you will. Because you're making the same point I'm making. If you have to start prior to that. And it's more, for me, it's more an issue of right and wrong. It's more an issue of what furthers society.
And I completely evade what is right and wrong because you're imposing your values onto a sexuality,
It's problematic.
and that's why I don't think that we
Which
should
is why I
do
don't
that.
address consent.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I want to clarify before we get too much further, because I do have some questions for you. I want to clarify something in my presentation. The spectrum that I presented to you is still a bit of a work in process. It's not completely set, but it is not based on bestiality versus zoophilia. I think, like I believe you think, that's the wrong paradigm. I think those two buckets are not sufficient to describe the entire spectrum of behavior. I see it as a sexual orientation. And in that framework that I showed you, I don't even use the term zoophilia, bestiality. I avoid those two terms. I think it describes, as you said, the behavior versus the
Lifestyle.
the lifestyle. That wasn't
Or
term.
identity.
Identity. Thank you. To me, zoosexuality it kind of encompasses that. It does include the identity.